So, let's talk about veganism. For context, I'm not a vegan. Like most people, I just eat meat because I like it. But that's part of the interesting thing about this movement. It falls into a fascinating category of social discourse where it's one side who are morally motivated, passionate warriors for a cause attempting to change society against people who just don't have an interest in thinking about it. Usually, this is because most of those folks don't feel an acute pain of any kind in relation to the issue. The onus falls to the motivated minority not only to convince the quote unquote opposition to agree, but to convince them to engage in the first place. This is why they almost necessarily have to use tactics that are annoying. The same was true of the women's suffrage movement or the teetotalers trying to create prohibition. Both movements are trying to convince the majority to change their minds on an issue that the majority doesn't even view as an issue. These two also demonstrate the nearly binary outcome of discourses of this type. If the motivated minority successfully forces the issue into the broader public consciousness, you generally have one of two outcomes. Sometimes, like with women's suffrage, it turns out the movement was actually successfully pointing out an unexamined belief or practice that doesn't actually square with society's current morality, in which case, at the beginning, only a few were convinced of the idea, and the majority would have found it to be a silly conversation, but ultimately, the majority ends up agreeing with the stance, with only a few holdouts who are now the minority. Other times, it may get into the national discourse, even have its day in the sun, but it turns out it was actually just kind of an extreme idea, and we move on, no longer really considering it a possibility. So, which one is veganism? Will we look back and think it's crazy that we ever ate animals, or will we look back and laugh at the extremeness of the vegan movement? Figuring out which one veganism is requires looking past the folks who are in it for more identitarian reasons and dealing with the moral questions at its core, which, it turns out, might help you decide if you're down with humanity being enslaved or genocided or modified by the AI. Will the AI be vegan? So, does the suffering of animals have any moral significance at all? If I burn my cat to death for no reason, is that evil? The intuitive answer is yes. If someone in my neighborhood kept buying kittens and burning them to death, he would appear evil. But it's hard to move forward from this intuitive idea unless we put together a good logic for why animal suffering matters and how much it matters. And probably the most compelling case I've seen around this is from a kindly old Australian man who you might recognize as the guy who has a habit of articulating moral arguments so clearly it forces you to acknowledge the moral incoherency of your whole fucking life. But before becoming the kindly old man he is today, he was just a devastatingly handsome, hungry young Australian professor in 1985 who wrote the book Animal Liberation, which basically uses the principle of equal consideration of interest to make the case that if humans have rights, animals have rights too, and those rights include not being subjected to the fucking mind-blowing, torturous hellscape of modern industrial farming. I'll put a bit more description of his argument right there if you want to pause and read it. I actually recommend getting the book, but while his case uses similar lines of logic, you don't have to take Peter Singer's argument whole hog for this consideration to begin to get your attention. For the purposes of this conversation, let's reduce it to this. It definitely seems like animals are capable of suffering. If they're capable of experiencing suffering, inflicting suffering on them has some moral weight. Now, if you've done any exploration at all of the conditions in most of the meat and dairy industry, this is enough to make the question seem worth engaging with. Then we need to ask, is the moral weight of animal suffering the same as the moral weight of human suffering? The intuitive answer is usually no. If a kid, even like my least favorite kid in the neighborhood, is in a fight to the death with a possum, even like a cute baby possum, and I have a gun, I'm shooting that possum. But the intuitive answer isn't necessarily the correct answer. We need to figure out why we think human suffering has more moral weight, and maybe even by how much. Would you rather kill a dog than a human? Would you rather torture a dog than slap a human? Would you rather burn 20 dogs alive than skip breakfast? We have to click down on what the basis of this preference for human well-being is if we want to know how to translate the difference into meaningful weighting of the options, so we can decide things like whether our society ought to eat meat. If the only basis we have is an a priori assertion that humans are the only animal with moral significance simply, because, then we're making an arbitrary distinction between the moral value of two beings based on characteristics that could be morally irrelevant. That is pretty logically similar to sexism or racism. It's just delineating on a different arbitrary distinction. So really, if this is a justified distinction, there would have to be an intellectually honest reason to think that this barrier, unlike race and sex, is actually morally relevant. This conversation almost always now turns to intelligence. Smashing an ant with a hammer might be more morally preferable to, say, smashing a cow with a hammer, which in turn is preferable to smashing a human with a hammer. Perhaps if we put animals in a spectrum of intelligence, we get a sense of how important their suffering is. This is a good intuitive basis to move forward, but you're going to have a tough time sticking with this one. There are two really big problem areas. The first problem area is here. There's one issue of how much less valuable animals are that would need to be worked out, but more importantly, there are a lot of uncomfortable questions when you apply this universally, including between humans to decide who is stupid and who is morally valuable. With evidence of rational thinking as a basis for the moral value of humanity, you no longer have a moral justification for evaluating the severely brain damaged, or mentally challenged, or vegetative for that matter, over some animals. And especially given how we treat animals, that feels pretty icky. It's around this point that you might be wondering, man, if I'm working this hard to find a way to make intelligence work, maybe part of me really just did inherit the belief that humanity has a special divine spark, being made in God's image unlike any other animal and given righteous dominion over them. Or at least I act like I believe it. But let's take this intelligence argument to its other problem area. First, resize the scale. Extend it over this way, and you'll find that problem area right here. A general AI would be, by almost any measure of observable intelligence, more intelligent than a human. By far. If moral consequence scales with intelligence, in the kind of nonlinear way that previous argument acts like it does, a general AI's simple pleasure might be as much more morally important than human suffering as the human pleasure of having cheap bacon is to a pig suffering. If you're trying to make an observable intelligence justification rather than a God says we're special argument for why animal suffering is less significant than that of humans, then you are also morally justifying an AI treating us just as cruelly for just as marginal benefit to itself. You may squirm at this point and work to find a way to disagree with the AI's assessment that its overall morally acceptable outcome for humans to live in cages going slowly mad while being fed paste and antibiotics long enough to keep them alive for harvest. But why should the AI care what you think at all? Do you care what a cow's moral opinion is? If we bring this argument up another level, something that you would almost certainly agree with is that we are better equipped than cows to make the moral distinction in the first place. But, perhaps, whose suffering matters more as a question is less important than whose opinion about whose suffering matters more. We hadn't even considered the possibility that we shouldn't even have the moral authority to ignore the cow's opinion, to decide whether our own actions are moral. We're forming a human opinion about it, obviously presupposing that our opinion matters, whereas the cow's doesn't because it is less intelligent. To the degree we put aside the cow's obvious preference not to be in a terrible condition, the AI is justified in ignoring whatever our preference is. The same logic would make our own opinion almost completely devoid of value versus the moral ponderings of a significantly more intelligent general AI. It would know the better answer to the moral question. So I sure hope the AI thinks like a vegan, and that veganism is the, quote, morally better answer by a more intelligent agent. Because if it doesn't, we're screwed. I'll be making more of these, so if you like this stuff, take your cursor on over to that corner and hit subscribe.